people really think that when you have a disability, your life is less valuable. And I don't want to say that's true for everybody. And I think certainly over the course of my life, things have been changing because of advocacy that many people have been advancing here in the US and around the world. But I think the average person, when they learn that someone has a disability, there really is a tone of sadness. When I was about 8 years old, a young boy in our neighborhood who I didn't know came over to me when my friend was pushing my wheelchair and asked me if I was sick. I think it was the word sick that really threw me off. At that age, I was recognizing that the word sick really had a negative connotation. I knew that I did things differently. I didn't walk, but it didn't feel like the word sick. When you're sick, you don't go to school, you're not active in the community. Usually for me, it's like you had a fever at that time. So I think that was really the first time that I really realized that people saw me differently, or at least this little boy did. When I was 5 years old in Brooklyn, New York, my mother did what every other parent did when their kid was 5. She took me to school to register me. This was in the early 1950s. There were no motorized wheelchairs, so she pushed me to school, and it wasn't accessible. Accessibility was really nothing that was seriously being considered. Disabled vets had come home from the Second World War, and groups like the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association were beginning to address the issues of lack of accessibility in New York City and the state. But at that point, it certainly hadn't impacted schools at all. So my mom took me to school. She pulled me up the steps, and the principal said I couldn't go to school because I was a fire hazard. How was it explained to me? I don't really know that there was an explanation. It just was. And the principal said a teacher would come to my house for like 2.5 hours a week is what ultimately happened. But I never got to go to kindergarten. I didn't understand that I wasn't learning the same thing as other kids. My mother was working with me at home. It was really as I was getting older that I was beginning to understand that not only wasn't I going to school like my middle brother started to go to school and my neighbors who were my age, but I was not learning like they were. As I got older, I really began to think about why this was happening, and that's an important part really of how I gradually began to become more of an activist. My parents were great role models. In my book, Being Human, I open it up with, I never wished I didn't have a disability. Because I didn't, and I haven't. I mean, my life would probably be quite boring if I didn't have my disability. I mean, it would have been more typical. Maybe I would have gone to school and who knows what I would have done. But I think for me, my disability has really enriched my life. That being said, I don't wake up in the morning and think, great, what forms of discrimination am I going to experience today? If I didn't have a disability, I would have been a typical person, whatever that means. I think having a disability really has allowed me to do and get in touch with so many things and opportunities that otherwise would not have happened.
Did you ever feel like as a kid you were made to feel ashamed or guilty for having polio?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know that I ever felt ashamed, but I certainly have felt guilty or apologize for things that I need help with. I feel like friendship and family, we do things for each other. So I'm certainly not saying that every time I need assistance, I need to be paying someone. I think it should be like normal, natural kinds of interactions. But when I was younger and I lived in New York and I was taking voice lessons and I had to get driven to the city because the transit system wasn't accessible, and my brother or cousin or my dad would have to not do something that they wanted to do, then I would feel badly sometimes because my brothers might not let me forget that they had to do something that they didn't really want to do. I think it's something that many people feel, particularly people who maybe were able to do everything by themselves in the past, and they now have a disability which is not enabling them to do things which they did before. The more that we can have disability seen as something which is normal and natural, I think that also really assists people in not feeling guilty. Because I've never, as I said in the book, I've never thought about myself seriously, like what would my life be like if I didn't have a disability. It just really wasn't and isn't a part of who I am.
Can you describe a little of who your parents were and what their influence was on your future in advocacy?
My parents were German Jewish, and my mother was sent out of Germany when she was 12 to go to Chicago and live with distant relatives that she didn't know. And my father was 14 when he was sent out and lived with family, some of whom he did know. They lost their parents and other relatives who were murdered in the Holocaust in concentration camps. So when they got married, they were reestablishing themselves. They obviously didn't expect to have a child who got polio, and they didn't know other families who had kids with disabilities. So as they were getting over the fact that they had polio, and during the infectious period of time when, I was in the hospital and there were limited visitations, my mother was pregnant with my brother Joseph, and he was born a month after I had polio. So there was all this stuff going on, of which I really don't remember because I was 18 months old. But you can just envision kind of the chaos of what was happening with a new baby and a kid in the hospital. And they were resilient. My father had been in the Marines in the Second World War, and I think they were ready to start a family and create a new life for themselves. And so they just naturally were problem solvers. My mother in particular. My dad too, but he and his brother had a butcher shop and worked like 15, 16 hours a day. So he was supportive of my mother, and my mother was trying to kind of figure out what to do when I was denied the right to go to school. And remembering that this was in the early 50s, there were no laws in place, didn't know other parents. And as things began to evolve, and I finally was able to get into classes for disabled children, that's when she was also meeting other parents who had kids with disabilities. And it was the parents that I think being able to be together really enabled them to both recognize that they envisioned a future for their disabled children similar to what they envisioned for their non-disabled children. They looked at problems and really tried to resolve them. So the next big issue, there were many, but the next big issue was that if you couldn't walk upstairs, you went back on home instruction. You didn't go to high school. And so my mother and other mothers fought with the Board of Ed to get some of the high schools made accessible. So I did get to go to a high school. I was bused to the high school and took many of my classes with non-disabled children. So I would say that was really the first time that I was in an educational setting where I was in the same classes as non-disabled children. So for the first time was really beginning to learn like other kids. I think what's important when we talk about the history of the U.S. is also to recognize that this story is unfortunately still a story that exists in many countries. According to UNESCO and UNICEF, significant numbers of disabled children, like 70-80%, who have disabilities are not in school. And that of those children that are going to school, many of those children are in segregated schools. So we unfortunately repeat and then have to break down those problems. A friend of mine in high school, Evelyn Furtado, had died, and they started an award. And I was the recipient of the first Evelyn Furtado Award. The high school, Shifte wasn't big enough to hold our entire graduating class, so we had to go to Brooklyn College. When we got to the college, everyone getting awards was supposed to sit on stage. And so we found that my father was pushing my wheelchair, and we found that there was no ramp. So he went to pull my wheelchair up the steps to get onto the stage, and the principal came over and said that he didn't need to pull me up the steps, that I could just sit in the first row, and he would come over and give me my award. I was mortified, humiliated. And for me, if I could have on my own, I would have left. But my father really, he wasn't having any of it. And so he and the principal spoke, and the principal said I could come on stage, but I'd have to sit in the very back. So my father pulled me up the stairs, sat me in the back. My name was called for the award. I couldn't push myself very quickly, so I didn't get to go up and accept the award. I just got to move forward a little bit, and they came over and gave it to me. That response from the principal clearly was another statement that, not just me, but we as disabled people weren't considered to be equal, because they didn't have, if you got a certain type of award, you sat in the audience. If you got another type of award, you sat on stage. Everyone who was getting recognition of one sort or another was on stage.
How did you become a justice leader? How do you think about your path to becoming a justice leader?
I kind of joke, but not so much a joke really, that it's because I'm from Brooklyn, where no was something that wasn't acceptable. When people said no, I couldn't do something, directly or indirectly, over time, that became something that viscerally was not going to accept in many cases. One of the big turning points in my life was when I was denied my teaching license. When I was ultimately denied my license because I couldn't walk, I really had to make a decision as to whether or not I was going to accept that denial and really struggle with it for the rest of my life, because here was something that was a clear no. When I had taken the classes I needed, I had taken the required exams, and had failed the medical exam because of, quote, paralysis of both lower extremities, sequelae of poliomyelitis. Ultimately, I made the decision to move forward with litigation because I got a call from a gentleman named Roy Lucas, who was writing a book on civil rights. And he called me because there had been an article in the New York Times supporting my right to be able to become a teacher. He called me to learn about the types of civil rights violations that disabled people were experiencing. And I really liked him. I liked the questions that he was asking. He didn't feel to me like he was backing off of the discussion, but was really leaning into it. So at the end of the discussion, I asked him if he would represent me, and he said yes. And that was a real relief for me, because I'd made a decision, which maybe I'd made earlier, but I didn't know a lawyer, and we didn't have money. We did litigation at that point in the late 60s, early 70s, in the area of disability was really nothing significantly that was happening. When you're kind of moving into an area where other people haven't proven themselves, I think, questioning whether I could do a good job, and if I didn't, what would that mean for other disabled people? I was very intrigued by being able to get involved with the Berkeley CIL from pretty much the beginning. For those of us who had our disabilities when we were younger, we had experienced what I've been discussing: segregated education, lack of equity, lack of expectations. If you had your disability when you were in your late teens moving forward, you pretty much had a life in place. You were very likely to have had an education equivalent to other kids in your community. And I think all of us, that we were learning about other people, we were learning about different forms of discrimination, and the remedies might be different, but we needed to know what the remedies could be, and we needed to be able to support each other. So I think many of those things were really coming together more when I was in Berkeley, in part because I was working within the organization and was in a position to help create the programs and directions that we wanted to move in. When I was in graduate school, I had to do a 6-month residency. There was a job opening in the Senate for a legislative aid position, working for the chairman of the Labor and Public Welfare Committee. And he was also responsible for the subcommittee on the handicap, which is what it was called at that time. And so I got permission from Berkeley, and it turned into a 1.5-year position. That was another very important time in my life because it was an opportunity to work for a senator with a great team of people who were doing work on advancing legislation, like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a pivotal piece of legislation in the U.S. granting disabled children basically the right to go to school and be in what we call the least restrictive environment. It also was an opportunity for me to learn about government, how government actually worked. It was exciting for me to be able to see that there were disabled people around the United States we were all on the same page. We'd been learning a lot from the civil rights community, from the women's rights community, from the anti-war movement. And we were recognizing very much that we had to speak up for ourselves. And that one of the other critical problems that had been going on, and still is to a lesser degree, but still today in a significant way, is people look at us as the label of our disability. And it is a part of who we are, but it is not who we are. And it really allowed us to, when looking at a rights-based movement, being able to begin to argue and fight against what we call the medical model and really move it to the rights-based or justice-based movement. And recognizing very early on that the problems that we were dealing with, the discrimination that we were dealing with, it wasn't just, could a bus be made accessible? But it was, did people believe that we had a right to be on an accessible bus? And really the biggest problem was, and I'm just using buses as an example, people didn't believe that we had a right to be on the bus. And if you didn't believe we had a right to be on the bus, then that really meant that you were going to fight. I think that invigorated people, many people, to really begin to internally recognize that we wanted something not only better for ourselves individually, but that collectively we wanted to make significant change so that people would be able to live their lives and their disability be a normal part of it. One of the first pieces of legislation that the disability community really engaged in was getting regulations developed for a provision of law called Section 504. Section 504 says you can't discriminate against someone who has a disability if the entity is receiving money from the federal government. It was a 42-word piece of legislation with no real definitions, no direction on what to do. And health, education, and welfare and disabled people also were getting involved in the development of the regulations, which was very important. And between 1972 and 1977, there was a lot of work that went on in getting those regulations developed, but President Ford refused to sign them. And so when Jimmy Carter was running for president, the disability community, one of its requests was that he would sign the regulations for Section 504. It was an organization that had been formed called the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. And it was a cross-disability group. And one of the reasons it was formed was to fight for the regulations for Section 504. And we were learning that the secretary at that time, Joe Califano, was doing a review of the proposed regs, which we really understood. But we were also hearing from people we knew internally that he was looking at reviewing some critical parts of the regulations. And ACCD basically came together and said, these regulations are signed by a specific date or there will be demonstrations around the country. And they weren't, and there were demonstrations in 9 or 10 cities. And the demonstrations in the Bay Area with the Berkeley CIL and other centers for independent living and other disability rights organizations lasted for almost a month. And what was really significant about the longest demonstration in a government federal building in the history of the U.S. was the fact that many of the things I've been discussing really came together. Disabled people of different ages, with different disabilities, different racial backgrounds, really said enough is enough, and we're not going to allow something that we've all fought so hard for to potentially be watered down further. And there are a number of documentaries that have been made on the 504 demonstrations. One of the latest ones, Crip Camp. It was the first time that many of these young disabled people felt a part of something and really felt that they were making a difference, not only for their lives, but for the lives of many others. When I began working in the Clinton administration as an assistant secretary, people in those jobs, there are a lot of functions you have to go to. And I always felt uncomfortable going to functions where like 99% of the people didn't have disabilities. You know, I enter a room where everybody is standing and my first point of contact is somebody's butt. And, you know, trying to enter into these discussions when you can't hear people is, you know, something I had to learn to get over. I previously wouldn't go to those events, but then I just decided it was part of my job, that I could not go because it was part of my job. And I learned how to do it. But, you know, you go into these rooms and you feel the eyes and the stares of people, you know, not exactly knowing why you're there at first and trying to figure out how to engage in the discussions. It's something that I've learned to overcome. But if I would have been integrated in school throughout my life, it would have been something that would have been different. Being integrated into society is very important because it gives you a different image of yourself.
30 years after the ADA has passed, why do people with disabilities still have difficulty finding work?
Ending discrimination against any group is something that doesn't happen overnight. Segregation is one of the causes, I believe, for our still having too few disabled people who are qualified in the workforce, because people weren't getting together and breaking bread together. I was involved with a focus group at one point, and a father in this group who was an employer, when asked a question about hiring disabled people, said that he knew that his 5-year-old daughter was going to be different than him because his daughter was going to school with a child who had Down syndrome. But he wasn't there yet. So I would say that this lack of integration, lack of inclusion, really has allowed people to hold myths about what disabled people can and can't do. Many employers are recognizing their legal obligations. But again, I want to say that many employers are also recognizing that there are qualified disabled people out there. I think we are beginning to see more meaningful changes. But we really have to continue to be evaluating as employers, what are our policies and practices how are we recruiting? What biases exist within our organizations that really, if you have two people that are equal and one person has a disability, will potentially allow you to think about the non-disabled person before the disabled person. I think those are some of the changes that we're needing to make. And what I think is really also better today is there are people coming forward with greater qualifications because they are getting better education. We have a dwindling working age population. We really can't afford any longer to keep people who are qualified and want to work away from the workforce. Another important issue is that there are more people with invisible disabilities who are beginning to identify as having a disability. And I think, again, this is really important because a substantial number of people who have disabilities have invisible disabilities. And if we can't bring our whole self to work, then I think that not only impacts on the individual person, but it also impacts on the quality of work that can be done.
What do you say to young people who are living with a disability and experiencing similar emotions and discrimination that you processed as a kid?
I tell people that they need to believe in themselves and that it's important to have friends with disabilities. In social media, where you may not actually meet people face to face, we need to learn that the exclusion that we are experiencing is not right. We are powerful people. And to have both a belief in ourselves and where we want to go, what we want to do. But I'm a very, very big believer that doing things together is very important. I also am a very big believer that the disability rights community cannot stand on its own. We need to be working with all other movements, and we want all other movements to be inclusive of disabled people. The women's movement, the movements of color, sexual orientation. Disabled people, we're in all of those communities. You know, I define myself as a Jewish disabled woman, or a woman who's Jewish and disabled, or a disabled woman who's Jewish. All three components of myself are very important. In the disability community, I feel very comfortable. In the other communities, I feel like as I step into them, many people are still learning a lot. They don't really know what to do with us. And I think young people need to know that, and not just young people, and I think this is really important because disabled people acquire their disabilities more as they're getting older. So it's very important that we focus on younger people, but it's also important that we're focusing on people who don't have disabilities, but may very well acquire disabilities as they're getting older, to recognize that if you acquire a disability as you're getting older, it isn't something that should result in you're hiding in your home. It does mean that you can start preparing for things that may happen. It does mean that we have to be actively working together. And if we are actively learning and working together, we can do things like make sure when housing is being built in our communities that it's accessible, not just for people who have physical disabilities today, but if you're going to have a physical disability tomorrow. You know, when I lived in Berkeley, there were the Berkeley-Oakland fires, and there were hundreds of homes that were destroyed. What amazed me was when these homes were being reconstructed, they were not reconstructed so they were accessible. So people were going to get older, but unless they could really walk up lots of stairs, they were likely going to have to leave their homes. This is something that we should see as a society. Doesn't make sense. And so what I say to people is value your own life. Value and have beliefs of what you want to be contributing. And look at what you need to do in conjunction with others. Support disability rights organizations within the women's community and other movements. Really look sincerely at, are we meaningfully involving disabled people? Are they people in leadership positions? When we're organizing for events in state legislatures or federal legislation federal at the federal level, are we making sure that disabled people are a part of what's happening? Are we creating a community and an environment where exposing that you have a disability is not something you're afraid of? My name is Judy Heumann, and this is my brief but spectacular take on the disability rights movement.